Hello, everyone. My name is Jędrzej Czerep. I'm head of the Middle East and Africa program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And I'm very happy to welcome everyone at this seminar where we would discuss impact of the war in Ukraine on the food security in Africa and the Middle East. Polish Institute of International Affairs is a major Polish think tank and policy advisory institution. Together, we have picked up this critically important global issue in a number of publications, which we started to put out on our website. If you go to the website www.peace.pl, you would find latest analysis by Patrick Kugiel, who is here with us, which focuses on the impact of the global food production and food supply chains and the turbulences that occurred in the context of the invasion of Russia on Ukraine. You can also find my recent text on the impact of this war on food supply and fertilizers availability in Africa, in both in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We will have more. We will have also analysis on South America from a little bit different angle, more from the perspective of market competitors who could possibly replace Russia in some places. But to discuss this important issue, we have invited experts representing major research institutions from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. So apart from our hosting group, myself and my colleague Patrick, who is analyst on Asia, of the Asia Pacific program, and also focuses on development cooperation policy. So we are happy to have with us Sami Halabi, who is director of policy and co-founder of the Lebanese think tank Triangle Policy Research Media. Triangle conducts in-depth research, provides policy guidance, and develops media outputs which cover economic, developmental, and social issues. We also have with us Rai Hartley, who is research director of the Brain Trust Foundation from South Africa. He's also an author of the book Wretched Glory, The Rainbow Nation in Black and White, which tells the story of the first 2 decades of democracy in South Africa. Brain Trust Foundation is a policy advisory private institution which works with African governments. Brain Trust experts share international best practices with governments, addressing not just what to do, but how to do it. And Brain Trust Foundation is not a stranger to Poland. Its head, Greg Mills, was recently here in Warsaw on the very first day of the Russian invasion, and we have already exchanged thoughts on its effects on the food security by then. So we'll be happy to get some updates from the South African perspective today. And we also have with us Hamza Medeb, who is a non-research scholar at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center, where his research focuses on economic reform, political economy of conflicts, and border insecurity across the Middle East and North Africa. We at PISM have already crossed paths with Hamza during the EU ListGo project, focused on identifying risks connected to areas of limited statehood and contested orders in the EU neighborhood. Gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you all at this panel. And let's start with a global overview, with a global picture of how the war against Ukraine impacted food security situation in the global context. So please, Patrick, give us some a general view of what changed and what are the challenges.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this very timely and important discussion. I will briefly share a few thoughts on global perspective of what we mean when we talk about food prices in general in the world. I will first give you like 5 general points of what we are facing, and then share my final conclusions. So first of all, it goes without saying, or it's uncontroversial statement to say that Russian war against Ukraine has negative consequences for the whole world, not only for Europe, but maybe for all of us, and especially on developing countries. This we see in rising food prices, in rising energy resources prices, and problem of soaring prices of fertilizers. And this is basically because Ukraine, but also the Russian Federation, used to be among the largest producers and exporters of agricultural products. You are probably aware, but for the benefit of our audience, let me only remind us that, for example, 36 of global supply of sunflower oil and seeds were coming from Ukraine, as well as 9% of the wheat that was traded globally was coming from Ukraine, or 13% of maize. So not surprisingly, where we cut off such a big suppliers, then it will create some repercussions on the global food market. But also, there's a second point, we need to acknowledge that this crisis will have an equal effect on the world, with discrimination against, or it will be felt the most in the countries which are the most dependent on import of food from Ukraine or Russia. And it happened that most of those countries are located in the Middle East and in Africa. So that makes our discussion very also relevant. Just to also give you some numbers and facts, we might know already that, for example, Africa was importing like 44% of its wheat import from Ukraine and from Russia. More from Russia, like 32% and 12% from Ukraine. But for 15 countries in Africa, that import constituted more than half of its needs, more than half of its demand. So, and 23, do you hear me? And the 23 countries were importing more than 1/3 of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. So what is the problem? How it started? Basically, when war broke out in Ukraine, and because of the Russian intervention and blockade of the ports in the Black Sea, Ukraine had ceased to have an opportunity, to have physical opportunity to export its food products. So that stopped the export from Ukraine. But also the war and some logistical and financial constraints and obstacles caused problems for export of food products from Russia. And also the war itself impacted on rising prices of oil and gas, and rising prices of fertilizers. So that all contributed to rising food crisis. As a result of this, according to Food and Agriculture Organization latest estimates from the beginning of April, this season, that is until the end of June, from Ukraine will not export some 5 million tons of wheat, for example. But also Russia will not export more than 3 million tons of wheat, which makes a shortage of over 8 million tons of wheat. But part of this can be already substituted by delivery supplies from other regions, from European Union or from other Asian or North African countries. So according to FAO, we will face a shortage of, when we talk only about wheat, as an example, we will face a shortage of some 4 million tons of wheat. It's not actually some unbelievable number. Yeah, this means that the wheat export this year will stay at the similar level like it was last year. So that shows at the global level, there's not a problem of availability of food. The problem is that this problem will affect differently different countries. And what we see at the general global level is that we will not face possible hunger, but we will face mostly, and we will be hit by rising food prices, by the inflation. And also according to FAO price index of food products, already in March, we observed that the average price of food production in the world has risen by 33% year to year. So this is unbelievable, huge increase of prices of food. And certainly in particular products like wheat or edible oils, these prices went up even more. So increase in prices is what creates the biggest challenge for the international community. And what makes this situation so serious and critical is that the war in Ukraine came just after we were going out, recuperating from the global pandemic, COVID-19 challenge, which already had a very negative and strong impact on food prices globally. Even in February, so before the war in Ukraine, the average FAO prices index of agriculture products went up 22% in 1 year from February 2021. So the food crisis, so-called, started even before the war in Ukraine, but it exacerbated the ongoing, more long-term structural problem that we are facing. So this creates not only problem in availability and access to food and prices of food, but this creates serious economic challenges for the governments in many developing countries, which subsidize food, which has already been indebted long before the war in Ukraine. So this also makes the challenges only bigger, and this might create economic crisis and turn into some kind of even political upheaval in some places. Yeah, so to conclude, I would like to make 3 points. First of all, we must remember that this crisis, for this crisis, the sole responsibility is borne by the Russian Federation. It is not the problem of sanctions. It is problem that Russia invaded Ukraine and blocked the ports in the Black Sea in the first place. So the shortest way to somehow resolve the problem would be if Russia will go and stop its aggression in Ukraine. But that might be maybe asking for too much. At the moment, it might be an unlikely scenario. So what we can do next, and my second conclusion is that this food crisis is manageable challenge. We have enough food in the world to feed the world, to supply enough food to countries facing challenges at the moment. Yeah, the food production this year, as I said, is at the same level like it was a year ago, and projected trade in this is also at the level of the last years, and we have a lot of food in many strategic reserves of many developed and other countries. So food producers must now provide supplies of food to countries most vulnerable and affected by the current crisis. So most of them would be from Middle East or from Africa. And final point is that we need also kind of financial and economic support, because this food crisis is basically an economic challenge, an economic crisis for most of developing countries. So they would need not only food, but they rather would expect some kind of financial and economic support. We need to probably come back to discussions about the debt reductions or annulation of debts. We need to think about some structural reforms in many developing countries to make them less dependent on food import from abroad, to increase the resilience to that kind of crisis in the long term. So I think developed countries, European Union, United States, and others have a big role to play to support the most vulnerable countries, mostly affected by the current situation, but also to support international organizations which are providing humanitarian assistance to many countries and which are facing also increased costs of their operations. So we cannot forget about the humanitarian crisis, which are ongoing around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, and other places. And for this, I think the West needs to step in and take more responsibility to support those the most affected by the current situation and the war in Ukraine. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this introduction. The sound quality was not always perfect, so let's hope our next speakers would be heard well. Let's move on to North Africa first, and let me ask Hamza Medeb to provide his contribution. Tunisia is quite a unique country to start with. If you look at statistics on which country is importing wheat or grains from which country, it's usually Russia, which is the main supplier. But Tunisia, if you look at statistics, is the one which takes the most from Ukraine. So the impact of the war is would probably be more direct on Tunisia than on other countries. We've heard about rationalizing bread supplies or cutting bread production. So please, Hamza, tell us more about the impact not only on Tunisia but also on other countries of the region of North Africa. Many of them are subsidizing bread prices, which surely puts another burden, puts another constraint on state budgets when prices soar. So tell us more about the situation and also about the policies that states of the region adapt to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jidrich, for the invitation, and thanks to PISM for organizing this panel. Actually, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, Tunisia but also Egypt are two big importers of wheat from Ukraine for Tunisia. I mean, 50% of almost 50% of Tunisia's wheat is imported from Ukraine, and Egypt is importing almost 80% of its needs from Russia mainly, actually. As you can imagine, I mean, the shock and the war in Ukraine has impacted, I mean, actually all countries in the region, but mainly and most importantly, these two countries, I mean, unlike maybe Algeria, which is an oil producing and exporting and gas exporting country, I mean, benefiting from the rise of the prices of gas and of oil, Tunisia and Egypt have been actually struggling from long existing problem, if I would say. And I think Patrick has, I mean, rightly mentioned an extremely important point, which is that this crisis, this food prices crisis, is really exacerbating already existing problems in many countries. And this is typically the case of Tunisia and Egypt. If we take Tunisia, I mean, the country is going through a shaky political transition. I mean, after a power grab operated by the president, but it has been going for 2 years almost now in an economic and financial crisis. I mean, the country is struggling to find an agreement with the IMF, not agreeing on many points actually related to the public sector wage bill and to the lifting of the subsidy budget or the reduction of the subsidy budget. And actually, this crisis, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated the problems. Today, I mean, Tunisia is spending 50% of the budget spending is allocated to subsidizing food and energy. And this budget will be increasing and is currently increasing because of the prices. So this tells you to what extent, I mean, the war in Ukraine and its impact on the food prices and on energy as well is really impacting and is a sort of a shock, really acting as a shock, really destabilizing further Tunisia. But this is also the case with Egypt, because Egypt is returning for the fourth time in 10 years to the IMF to negotiate and to discuss a new program with the IMF, with the objective, of course, I mean, on the table, one of the main objectives and conditionality for this program is to reduce the subsidy budget. And in both countries, in a situation where there is a very limited fiscal space, where the financial margin of maneuver of both countries are limited, and especially in the case of Tunisia, because Tunisia is banned access to international financial markets. I mean, Tunisia is really, I mean, trying to secure this agreement with the IMF in order to be able to sell its debt and to secure again a new access to the international financial markets. I mean, this situation is really exacerbating and aggravating actually the problems with eventually high potential risks. We are talking about social risks. We are talking about really, I mean, an incapacity or an additional burden for decision makers on the way to manage this crisis. I mean, the social consequences of this crisis. I mean, they are in the sort, I mean, especially in Tunisia, the government is finding itself caught in a situation where increasing prices will be extremely costly, I mean, from a social and political perspective, but also keeping the subsidy budget as it is simply unsustainable, actually. So what the government went for is, especially with the energy, is to operate a sort of to implement an adjustment, a price adjustment mechanism, or to reactivate the price adjustment mechanism when it comes to energy. And when it comes to food, unfortunately, I mean, the country has been struggling with shortages in the supply. I mean, shortages in flour, in semolina, in sunflower oil, so in other products, in sugar, in rice. So this is basically, this shows and this reflects actually to what extent it's becoming difficult actually to the government to operate and to adjust the prices in the current context and in such difficult context. Now, I think that the idea of lifting the subsidies, of targeting the population, popular classes, etc., to make sure to reduce the budget of the subsidy budget will be crucial and will be one of the key pillars of any agreement with the IMF. And for sure, I mean, this will be a challenge for the government, simply because part of the middle classes, they won't be able to access to cheap prices or to food at, moderate or cheap prices. We can already think that and imagine that the unrest and the dissatisfaction won't be exclusively. The popular classes won't be dissatisfied, or the only social group that will be satisfied, but middle classes will be extremely hit by any price adjustment and any budget adjustment when it comes to subsidy, actually, to subsidizing food and energy. And this is typically also the case in Egypt. So how Tunisia is managing this situation? I think that I mentioned the fact that operating a periodic price adjustment when it comes to energy, and by the way, the increase in the prices of energy impacted as well the prices of food produced locally. We are talking about vegetables, etc., etc. So the prices of all agricultural products increased, over the previous weeks. So operating a sort of a progressive adjustment is currently implemented. Tunisia has also revised the prices of wheat that is locally produced. So in order to give more incentives to local farmers actually to increase their production, to increase the domestic production. This has become extremely strategic in order really to reduce the imports and to reduce the dependency, of course, of Tunisia on imported food, especially that the country, as I mentioned, is struggling to find foreign currencies, to find dollars and euros, of course, to pay its imports, given the economic and the financial situation. So these are basically actually the challenges that this increase in food prices is putting on decision makers in both Egypt and Tunisia. And the most important, I think, consequence, as I mentioned it earlier, is really the fact to exacerbate actually the burden and on decision makers, and to exacerbate actually these long-standing problems related to the budget deficit and related to trade deficit, actually, both on energy and on food for these two countries, Tunisia and Egypt. I'll stop here and happy, of course, to pursue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hamza, for this insightful view. Let me just remind our audience that you are very welcome to post questions on our YouTube chat, space. You should be registered. You should have a YouTube account to be able to do that. So if you have that, please log in and you'll be able to use the chats and put questions to our panelists. You've mentioned the gravity of the problem of how the middle class would sustain the soaring prices and the increasing food prices that we discuss. Recent World Bank estimates put it like that: like every percentage point increase in food prices will push 10 million people into poverty. And if you look at the recent statements from the World Bank, issued just after this week semi-virtual meeting, if COVID pushed World Bank to approve $157 billion from 2020 on, then this current war-related food crisis pushed World Bank to approve a similar amount of money to try to address the issue, not only both issues, the refugee flow from Ukraine and the global food crisis. But just looking at those figures makes us understand that this emerging crisis that we're discussing now is of comparable magnitude or comparable weight to the COVID crisis, and it's increasingly seen as such by major international institutions. To see it in this COVID perspective, it will be interesting now to go into sub-Saharan Africa, where Rai Hartley may explain us more. If COVID was an impulse, was a shock, but also an impulse for many African countries to do more to assure they are independent from external supplies of medical equipment or vaccines, then maybe this current food crisis would also be an impulse to do more, to be less dependent on wheat or other food products imports from abroad. But that would require proper systemic transformations of food production. So please tell us about how do you see the situation from South African and Sub-Saharan African states' perspective, both as a problem and as a possible impulse for reforms.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I think that the problem is that Sub-Saharan Africa is a major net importer of wheat. The countries that have highest wheat production, Ethiopia, South Africa, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Zambia, in that sort of order, are still dependent on imports. So, the largest wheat producer in Africa is Ethiopia. And I think we have to remember that there is a forgotten war going on in Ethiopia as well. That's also had its effects. So Ethiopian wheat production was on a very steep rise, steadily increasing year by year until 2019. And now it has trended downwards since then. It still remains the biggest wheat producer, but that has also constricted supplies in Ethiopia and elsewhere. So South Africa, I think, remains a very strong wheat producer that's on the upward path. And I think the reason for that is that it is one of the few countries that has embraced proper structural market reforms in agriculture. So in the old apartheid era South Africa, there was actually quite a you might say, even socialist possibly approach with very big state-controlled agricultural boards that bought and sold produce and controlled prices. And in the new South Africa post-1994, there was deregulation of that market. So in the late 1990s, especially early 2000s. And the initial effect was to affect production quite negatively. But ultimately, as time has passed, it has led to a fairly strong and robust and resilient agricultural sector. So agriculture is one of the areas of South African GDP that has been on the rise, despite GDP overall being particularly weak. South Africa still, however, is an importer of wheat, quite a substantial wheat. 40% of wheat is imported, and a third of those imports come from Russia and Ukraine. So obviously there are the two dynamics. The one is supply and dependence on supply from those regions, which, as we heard earlier from Patrick, are going to have lower supply, quite substantially lower supply. Then the other two dynamics, I think, are the market price of wheat, which has risen very substantially and has not yet played itself through in sub-Saharan Africa, but will over the coming months as the new import prices start to take their effect, and inflation, food inflation, is likely to rise quite dramatically. The other effect, however, is also weakening local currencies. So because wheat is now a traded commodity and with a dollar price, and the war and the uncertainty that it generates has caused a lot of contraction in investment, and also contraction in hot money that is invested in markets in the developing world and in the emerging market world. And this has resulted in some currency weakness. And that then adds to the difficulty in meeting payments for imports. So that is offset, I think, to some extent in some countries by rising commodity prices. So countries that are actually exporters of gas and oil, like Mozambique and Angola and the Southern African region, copper in Zambia, and South Africa with platinum and other minerals, to some extent can offset this problem by getting increased income from resources. But ultimately, I think that is, the spike in the resources increases is likely to not last as long or be as powerful as the spike in the dollar cost of wheat. So ultimately, I think there is going to be a pretty heavy effect. South Africa is particularly dependent on Russia, more so than Ukraine. So South Africa imported, in the last count, I think the last numbers, settled numbers of 2020 or so, $132 million of Russian wheat, and a further $14 million of Ukrainian wheat. And the effect is going to be pretty significant. And I think the factors that were touched on earlier regarding the potential for the social effects of this, I think, are quite serious. So in South Africa, there were large-scale riots in June last year that were in part driven by poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunities that people face. And we could see a repeat of that sort of outcome here and in other parts of Southern Africa when food inflation starts playing into the and starts having its effect. So South African unemployment, highest in the world, the formal rate measured in the 34-35%. The informal rate, which includes discouraged job seekers, is in the 40s. And so there's a very high potential for social unrest to start developing as a result of this food supply. And then finally, I would add that there are economies that are heavily aid dependent. I think of Lesotho and Malawi in the sub-region here, but many other smaller countries in Southern Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, aid budgets are under pressure because of the global effects, financial effects of the war. And that could then also weaken the ability of these countries to procure sufficient food. And we could see proper famine problems developing in some of these poorer countries. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now, but we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. The questions are popping up in our chat space, so we'll proceed to the discussion. After our last panelist provides us some initial thoughts on Lebanon, but not only in Lebanon, but also in other fragile countries or countries in a fragile situation in the Middle East. If instability was already a game in town in Lebanon, but also in other places, let's think of Yemen or Syria or the Palestinian territories, then do you see this additional burden, producing some qualitative change, or is it really an urgent, alarming situation in places where the situation was already urgent and already alarming? And if yes, then do you see any possible ways out? If not internal, then maybe coming from the international organizations, international initiatives. We have quite a plenty of them popping up in recent days. IMF, World Bank, EU are also sketching some plans, some initiatives. Do they have any resonance? Do they have any concrete shapes from your perspective? Please give us an overview from Lebanon.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Polish Institute of International Affairs for inviting me here today. Well, I think we have a real and substantially different food security crisis this time around. This time around, governments in our region are in much worse economic state than they were during the last food price crisis in 2008. And since then, there hasn't really been the kind of political reform or policy reforms that we need in these countries at a political level and at a food security level. Quite the contrary, in fact. And the result of that is that our region is currently and will remain inherently dependent on international food markets in the short term, and long-term solutions are in short supply. This dependency is really so stark because not only for natural reasons or climatic factors that sometimes contribute to this dependency, but also because it's the easier policy option for governments, which are not always interested in doing the hard work of building resilient food systems. For instance, our region, we buy around a third of the world's cereals, if you include North Africa as well, and we represent around 4% of the global population. And even previous to the Ukraine conflict, there were viable alternatives to black sea wheat. Black sea wheat was obviously the cheapest for governments, but they could have done some hedging, looking at more long-term solutions. I mean, Lebanon didn't even have a strategic grain silo, which is really, really basic policy measures to combat food security. So right now we're in an acute crisis, and we need short-term solutions to slow the bleeding. But this bleeding is going to continue because the short-term solutions are, for the moment, the usual handouts, the unsustainable subsidy policies, that have been going on for decades. And if we're ever going to stop this bleeding, we need to address the real causes, which are staggering inequality, rentier economies, elite capture, and so on. I mean, I think this time around, the region is in it for a longer crisis. I mean, all the predictions are going towards a longer-term food price crisis, even if there is enough supply to go around, as Patrick was mentioning. There is enough food in the global market. It's just about where do you get it from and how far is it from you and what kind of deal you can strike. But it takes time to make that adjustment. And we will see real challenges for the governments that are in power today. So yes, you know, the short-term cash-based solutions that are being worked on by World Bank, the EU, G7, and so on, I mean, those are needed. But what we really need is to solve the long-standing political and financial issues driving the inequalities, driving the conflicts, and the failed states themselves. If we don't do that, I think we're really just at the start of a vicious food insecurity and instability cycle. Obviously, the main issue right now is the price of wheat and the supply dependency on Ukraine and Russia. Just to put it in perspective, I mean, depending on which country you're going for, Ukraine was supplying somewhere around 15 to 16% of wheat supply. You add Russia to that, and you get to about 95% in Lebanon's case, for instance. Now, Lebanon is a great example of how food security crisis manifests in widespread instability. Of course, the problem is not supply, but access. So Lebanon imports 80% of its food in any given year, even foods that are natural to its natural environment. And because of the financial crisis that is caused by the political class and the banking sector, the currency has devalued 90%, which means people's savings have been wiped out. So at the same time, you have food prices inflation that has been around 400% per year in the past 2 years because of the currency devaluation. That's before the crisis in the Ukraine, right? And this is the issue for Lebanon is you can't run a country like a supermarket. You know, since the civil war, every Lebanese government decides there's no focus on productive economy, and especially not any focus on local agricultural production. You know, and we're in a country with no natural resources other than fertile land and relatively good water wealth in the region. And our economy is based on rentier sectors, just banking and real estate. It doesn't make too much sense, but that's what, you know, the neoliberal era brought to us in a sense. And so the main reason Lebanon doesn't have a viable agricultural industry that could hedge the food crisis is because the government wasn't interested in creating one. It went for the simpler solutions. And we never diversified supply from Black Sea sources or even, you know, thought of a strategic grain reserve. Now there's no money, there's little production, and there's no viable immediate alternative to import dependency. So should this continue, we're heading for a failed state in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the real issue is that food security is not a cornerstone of government thinking in Lebanon and in Syria and Palestine until there is a crisis. I mean, it's not so much the case for Syria. There was lots of thought to make Syria self-sufficient, and that also didn't go very well pre-war. Governments in the region know that there's that food insecurity can manifest into more instability and deeper conflict. But their response is to dip into the national foreign currency reserves, if they have them. Not all of them have them. And they fund unsustainable subsidy programs. And then you appeal to the international community. I mean, Egypt is a case in point, has just kind of been saved by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the IMF. Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Syria don't have that luxury. I mean, so there needs to be a reckoning, I think, with the root causes of inequality, conflict, which is wider than food security policy itself. You know, Lebanon needs the financial crisis to be resolved. The banks have to take their fair share of losses. People need to get their savings back. The peace process in Yemen needs to be harnessed. Otherwise, the famine, according to the UN, is expected to rise 5-fold from its current level. And you know, the issue people don't think about is instability can suit many of our leaders in our region. I mean, Lebanon's political class are the warlords of the civil war era. The links between poverty and radicalization can easily provide fodder for a conflict in Palestine, Syria, Yemen. So we need political solutions, solutions that change the economic structure. We can't have cartels of elites owning sectors, paying almost no tax, using the state as a tool for patronage. And the international community, in a sense, needs to understand there's a carrot and stick approach. I mean, for instance, in Lebanon, there's politicians and bankers have fallen afoul of the EU sanctions regime that's been in place since last July. As of now, the EU has not sanctioned one Lebanese politician. In fact, when you speak to the people of the European Union, they say it's Poland, Hungary, and Austria that are blocking these sanctions at the EU level. So these things need to change. I mean, conflict-affected states like Syria and Yemen, they don't have food security infrastructure anymore. And we need to rebuild that infrastructure. So longer term, we need to be thinking about food security needs in a different way. Climate change is going to really hammer economies after all of this abates to a certain extent. So we need to focus on food sovereignty, seeds, land, tools that are community owned, equally distributed, a transition away from subsidies towards a welfare state that's funded by progressive taxation. And finally, to admit that this region will always need the international food markets, but we can be smarter about how we diversify supply, combine imports with local production and social protection. And only then can we see a change in this region, I think, in terms of food security, but also Europe and the rest of the world will hope to avoid the widespread instability that this neighborhood has been witnessing as a result of very bad policies by very bad regimes that have maintained their grapple hold on power for decades. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sami. Well, you mentioned climate change, which already puts our economies on a burden. I just went through a set of ideas coming from the EU or EU states, and one of the recommendations coming from Hungary is simply that the EU should drop its climate goals, and by this it can accelerate agricultural production, which can eventually solve the problem. I'm not sure if it's a good recommendation or another example of short-term thinking, but yeah, many of our viewers would like to learn more about the EU approach or possible EU role in mitigating the current food prices. There is a question from, for example, from Hannah Knepen from European Center of Development and Policy Management, directly to Hamza Medeb. How can the EU or EU member states play a role in tackling the food security situation in Tunisia or Egypt, as you described it? Please, Hamza, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, there will be a new program, actually a sort of an emergency program implemented by the EU. I mean, there are some initial maybe already planning for a sort of emergency program for the southern neighborhood at the EU, but to help many countries actually to secure, I mean, their supply in terms of food, and to avoid sort of, shortages that could lead to instability, social instability, and of course, I mean, migration, etc. But strategically, I would like really to insist on what Sami has mentioned. Really, I mean, I think that the issue of food security should be put at the heart of any development strategies in this region, and I think this should be really perceived in or associated with an important and strategic reform on land. So land reform is a much needed one in Tunisia, for example, probably also in Egypt. So I think that there is a need really for Tunisia also to think of energy, because the increase of the prices of energy is also increasing the prices of food, and the food, I mean, produced domestically or in Tunisia. So in terms of energy, there is a high high potential for renewable energy, which is a missed opportunity for Tunisia. I mean, Tunisia is producing only 6 to 7% of its electricity from renewable sources, unlike Morocco, which is doing 30%, which is producing 30%. So I do think that these two deficits, the double deficit, the energy deficit and the food deficit, these countries really can work strategically on them, combining, as Sami mentioned. I mean, the imports with the increase of capacities of production in agriculture, with really strategic reforms. These are really, I mean, extremely important. And I think the EU can play an important role on that, because simply what we are witnessing in Tunisia, for example, is that part of the migration today is driven by climate change. Southern Tunisia is a region which is really suffering from shortages of water, of lack of investments, and of a problem of desertification, etc. So I think that strategically, this is a strategic area where the EU can get involved and can support, actually. And you mentioned really very rightly, I mean, the issue of climate change, which has become extremely important. I mean, let's think about food and energy in relation with water. And I think the water issue is extremely strategic now in North Africa. This is a region in a situation of water stress. I mean, water scarcity is currently an issue, and it has been an issue on the table for a while now in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Libya, and increasingly in Egypt. And you can understand this conflict, I mean, between Ethiopia and Egypt with regard to the Renaissance Dam, because also of the issues of water. So I think, yeah, especially when it comes to Tunisia, I think there is either in the short term or in the longer term. I mean, the short term, assisting the southern neighborhood countries with an emergency program, eventually to secure really a permanent and supply in terms of food. That could be an area, and I think things are progressing on that side. But also strategically, there is a lot to do when it comes to food, water, and energy, either on the renewables or on climate change or on water, actually, to help develop this the security on food and energy, actually.
Thank you very much. Patrick, may I ask you, I mean, recently there were news that, for example, the World Food Programme is starting to scale up the delivery of food aid into previously inaccessible areas of the Ukraine's conflict. But we often tend to forget, or maybe don't know, that Ukraine, which is now in a situation of a country in need of food assistance, used to be a major contributor to the global aid institutions, such as World Food Programme and others. It creates another set of problems, like countries which don't deal, I mean, wheat, who don't buy wheat from Ukraine or Russia, but who receive it from the major humanitarian or development oriented institutions, can also be, this flow can also be disrupted. Do you see how does that play out?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Ukraine was very key source of food for international organizations, international humanitarian organizations, and as you mentioned, World Food Programme alone was sourcing around 50% of its food aid it delivered to Yemen, to Syria, to other places from Ukraine. So the blockade and stoppage of of export of food from Ukraine did affected the international humanitarian organizations and activities. Why Ukraine was so important? For a number of reasons. First of all, the wheat produced by Ukraine was competitive in terms of prices, so it was cheaper than available from other sources. It was also convenient, yeah, for geographical reasons. So you could have the transportation costs were also lower if you provide food from Ukraine to Syria or to Yemen. That's just sounds logical to take it from the Black Sea region. So because of the war, international organizations found themselves in kind of difficult situation, which is again manageable, yeah, because it's possible. It's not that difficult to find another alternative sources of food for international organizations, but the only effect, the negative effect, will be the increasing costs of operations for those organizations. And World Food Program alone has already been saying that the monthly costs of operations went up by around $70 million. So per year, it makes a very substantial change, and it widened the gap, financial gap that is needed to be met in order to provide food to vulnerable people around the world. So again, yeah, the problem is growing also for international humanitarian assistance. This is doable, manageable, but it will cost more international donors and can create some short-term problems in deliveries, but it will be met provided that there is international solidarity. And since I have this opportunity, maybe if I can ask the question to our co-panelists, because I'm just getting very curious to understand in practical terms how this food crisis or war in Ukraine has already hit your countries, for example, and food prices in your countries. Could you illustrate that effect by, for example, telling us how, for example, your favorite bread, how the price for your favorite bread has increased over the last 3 months, or maybe 1 kg of wheat flour, so we can already understand whether this crisis has hit you or not yet, probably, and to what extent, if you know the price.
Yeah, okay, maybe.
This is questions to all of you. So
maybe let's make
tell us how much is for
round.
bread in South Africa or in Lebanon these days.
I mean, I can tell you that my favorite bread isn't Arabic pita bread, so that's the first thing to say. But the price has been, I mean, the price is government regulated, and over the course of the financial crisis, we've seen them raise it in line with the devaluation of the currency. But what they've also done is reduce the volume of the bread inside of the packet without raising the price to create the illusion that they weren't raising the price or of bread of the loaf of Arabic pita bread, and really, just a practical example. I went to the supermarket next to my house the other day, and they didn't have bread. I mean, that's the first time that's really happened to us in the neighborhood, and I'm not, we're talking about a middle class neighborhood. So you can imagine the effects in lower income neighborhoods or areas of the country. This is interesting because there's we do have local production of wheat in Lebanon. It is a durum wheat, which is more suitable for pastas. But you can also make breads out of it. But the problem is that you can't just transition overnight to another production chain that's based on a different kind of wheat and a different kind of bread and a different kind of processing. It just doesn't work that way, and I think that's the real problem we have, because otherwise we could have used 10-20% that we make locally to hedge the food price shock, but we're just not able to do it because we don't have the production cycle in place.
What about Tunisia?
Yeah, actually, the price of bread, of the subsidized bread or regulated prices, actually, they almost, de facto, not really legally, but de facto increased by 25%. So instead of 200 millims, which is less than 200 millims, I have to make the conversion in my so basically the increase in the prices of the subsidized price has been, the subsidized bread has increased by 25%. But this is not really legal. This is a de facto, actually, because simply the bakeries, they had to compensate. They tried to compensate the fact the fact they are really undersupplied by flour and by semolina, etc. Now, what we saw also is that new varieties of bread have been, produced to be sold in the non-regulated prices. This is, so there are new sorts of, not based really on flour, because the bread that is based on flour, which is almost 95% of the consumption of Tunisian population is a bread made of flour, is actually regulated by the state. But other types of bread, made by other types of wheat, etc., they are not really, the prices are not regulated, so bakeries can ask for a fair price, actually, and the prices they increased in the sense that it can be sold at almost at the price could be 50 cents, 50 cents of euros, half a euro or a third of euro, etc., which is really not the case with the regulated prices, extremely cheap, kept in to be affordable for really, popular classes. But de facto, which is really interesting, is that the adjustment is already getting implemented by bakeries in a way that they increase de facto prices. It's not the state, it's not the government which is increasing prices, but some bakeries, simply because the bread is not really available at any time. So, and people are keen actually to pay a bit more in order to have and to access to this subsidized bread.
Thank you very much, Ray. What about an average South African? Does he or she feel the direct impact of on bread or other food costs?
Yeah, I think the general inflationary cost of food are already rising, but the impact of the wheat imports will only be felt in the coming months. So South Africa imported some 732,000 tons early in the year. So wheat, being a winter crop, is being produced now, and we'll go into the local cycle here. So it's probably going to take a month or two before the full impact is felt. But the general inflation increase has been rising already without the Ukraine impact. So it's going to be pretty high when it happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think both of you, Rai and Sami, mentioned the effect of the food crisis like that on social instabilities. You mentioned 2008. I remember that one, the moment, the food crisis that was playing out around 2007 and 8, for example, toppled the first democratically elected government of Mauritania, which was elected with great hopes and great expectations and really started well, but just couldn't sustain the soaring food prices, and after a year was toppled in a coup in 2008. Arab Spring was also connected to the rising food costs and general costs of living. That's quite obvious now. But do you foresee the likely new wave of social and political unrest as something that could offer another chance of taking governments into account, of demanding more reforms, or do you rather foresee it as a rather destructive, violent wave of food unrest? Maybe Sami, could you start first?
Sure. I can take this one first. Yeah, I think it'll be somewhere in the middle, right? We see that in the region there is a memory of 2011 and what became of many countries in that region. I don't think there is an appetite amongst most of the populations to engage in that sort of process. I mean, obviously the Arab uprisings were unprecedented in nature and scale and consequence and so on. I don't think that's really on the cards for the moment. At the same time, governments have to respond, and we're in the same situation in so many countries in the region: Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, currency crisis, IMF packages. This push towards finally moving the economy and society towards something that's not based completely on elite capture of economies and rentier states, and towards social protection, and away from these piecemeal cut and slice policies of let's just subsidize the bread and everybody will be fine. I mean, this obviously hasn't worked. And so what I think is going to happen is that governments are going to need to become a little bit more sophisticated. Power structures are going to need to give over some things. There are going to have to be some sacrifices at the top levels. But personally, I can't see that much accountability arising at the moment, unfortunately, unless it comes from the outside. I think that the real power in the world doesn't rest in our hands. The real power in the world rests with those who have the resources and the military power and so on and so forth. We see that playing out, of course, in Ukraine, which is the topic of our conversation in terms of food security. There's a lot that the West can do and its role to play in our region with regard to pushing these regimes towards reform. And having a carrot and stick approach, because aid is very much needed. Long-term solutions are very much needed. But these governments are just going to play boogeyman with radicalization, migration, and these kinds of problems that have emanated from our region until they see some real consequences. And sanctions are an effective tool. We see that now with Russia and the Ukraine conflict. And they're not being played properly in our region. I think the West, Europe in particular, needs to understand they cannot just support autocrats up and down the region and expect things will change in this region. It won't happen. But at the same time, people are tired. Lebanon being a case in point. People always ask us, why isn't everybody on the streets every day? And you say, well, people are tired. They tried that already. We tried a civil war. We saw what happened in Syria. I don't think people are ready for that kind of upheaval, but at the same time, something needs to be done. So it needs to be a combination of things, and we need to focus on the right issues, not handouts and continually propping up unsavory regimes that have no interest in relieving themselves of elite capture. I mean, this, I think, is the main issue we're facing.
And right, what about Southern Africa or broader region? We have recently, observed a number of situations of political transitions where hopes were raised. Malawi, Zambia, Tanzania, or Angola. South Africa is anticipating, the governing party reshuffle in its conference and the possible new configuration of the leadership. How does those situations, when the food crisis crisscrosses this particular situations, how do you expect those countries to look like in a year or so?
Yeah, I think that's very good little summary that you made there, because I think there has been a sort of mini democratic spring in Southern Africa. So starting with the removal of the South African president, Jacob Zuma, who was involved in a lot of corruption and misgovernance and destroying a lot of state institutions. And then if you look, Zanzibar has a very reformist, very strong president, Mwini, that we worked with as the foundation. Tanzania, you had Magufuli, the populist, and he unfortunately died, but was replaced by a much more pragmatic person. Through to Malawi, where the undemocratic election result was overturned and fresh elections were held, and we had Chakwera. And in Zambia, you have Hichilema, who's an opposition leader, many years standing, who won an election there pretty decisively. So I think the problem is that all of these leaders are in a situation where they have to make some very tough decisions to reform their states and to take out a lot of the rents out of the system and to try and improve the efficiency really of the economies in the sub-region. But having to do that in a climate where you have this high inflationary pressure that's now going to be bolstered by food price increases, and especially fuel price increases, because most of these countries are net importers of fuel. I think you're going to find a very tough situation for them, and you might find a reversal of a lot of those gains, because it will be on their heads that there is this high food inflation and high inflationary costs and so on, and weakening currencies. So the timing is particularly unfortunate, I think, for the sub-region, and you could see a rollback of a lot of those gains and a return to the sort of populist type of leaders that will offer a short-term solution that's, from keeping foreigners out to dealing, imposing exchange controls, imposing more price controls, strengthening these agricultural boards, which are really just rent extraction devices, and introduce a lot of market inefficiency into the system. So that's the danger that the next year or so presents.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Mariusz Kotliński on the possible competition between let's see the donor countries or the donor institutions filtering aid or filtering programs through the political lens, like through taking it into account political stance or trying to use the food crisis for launching food diplomacy. We discussed COVID diplomacy a lot, and I think we can already start to foresee a food diplomacy. There was a recent blackmail coming from Russia that Russian government suggested that those countries, those partner countries in the world who are playing kind of hostile from its approach from its perspective, would not receive wheat supplies from Russia. A simple political blackmail like that. I mean, there are other countries like Lebanon who stood firmly with the country attacked in the conflict with Ukraine, and it's possibly, I mean, it could possibly have expected more generous or more open, more commitments coming from the EU side or from the Western world. Do you see this political game being played on the top of the food crisis in your regions? Does the political stance of your country create a specific context that could influence the partnerships? Sami, would you like to start?
Sure. I think, you know, the Lebanese foreign ministry came out with a very strong worded anti-Russian stance at the beginning of the conflict. But the reality in Lebanon is that you have, you know, Russia's allies, Syria, and their allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, that are very much in power in the country when it comes to vetoing, at least, decisions they don't like at the governmental level. So it's a little bit more complicated as usual with Lebanon. It's always a little bit more complicated. But I think that really the issue, especially at the EU level for Lebanon, is and you know, at the international community level, is moving towards a solution to the financial crisis for us, which isn't going to happen without external pressure. But at the same time, what I also think is an elephant in the room is the role of speculation in the rise of food prices globally, and how you know, they call it the ABCDs, the four big you know, producers, how they benefit from this situation where there are high prices. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but I've recently been reading about that role there, and the EU is renowned in its ability to monitor anti-competitive actions, speculation, unwarranted or warranted. I mean, within these realms of you know, the market, the free market, so to speak. So I think that, you know, from our perspective, you know, what can be done for us at the EU level is really you know, thinking about not just aid, but also real political consequences for regimes that do not want to comply with the very basic international human rights standards, and we're talking about economic rights when we talk about Lebanon, but also you can extend that further on. And using, you know, we need a solution to the long-standing conflicts. I mean, look at Palestine. Right now, what's happening in Palestine is a buildup of tensions around the holy sites, and that will inevitably, you know, lead to where we've always seen it lead to: another flare-up of conflict, another you know, a resurgence of this kind of dynamic that we don't really see the Europeans playing enough of an active role as much as, for instance, as the Americans do. And that's going to change in a multipolar world. It's already changing. And I think that's what we need to see, not just from the EU, but from the international financial institutions, is not to just be giving out handouts and hoping the problem goes away, because it's not going away. We need to think about real political consequences, because it's not a technical problem per se. But there is a market issue, and the markets need to be looked at. And when there is undue speculation, and or if there is any kind of hoarding, that needs to be taken care of as well.
Thank you, Hamza. I mean, the young Tunisian or Maghrebi populations used to be quite receptive to the Sputnik Arabic, for example, or to news coming from Russia, which also shaped the way the conflict is perceived and the way the context of the conflict is perceived. So nowadays the Russian propaganda is pumping up the message that it is all because of the Western sanctions and not because of the aggression. Well, how does it resonate in Tunisia? Do the popular sentiments evolve, or are they more? Is there really a competition for narratives between Russia and the Western partners, which can also be played on top of the food crisis?
Mm. Yeah, actually, I think there is a high potential of instability in North Africa. I think people are tired with austerity, actually, or war. I mean, you take the case of Libya. I think people, they are tired with civil war. You take the case of Egypt, Tunisia. They are tired with austerity and the consequences of the COVID. I mean, these economies haven't recovered, so they are really extremely weak and extremely fragile. Actually, that it makes things even worse. I mean, and I think you mentioned, I mean, this the narrative, the Russian narrative. Russia is present in Libya, as you know, through this Wagner Group, etc. But there is no competition, I mean, played or using food as vaccines, for example, used to be used by during the COVID time, etc. But my understanding is that probably, I mean, people are really, I mean, we can expect sort of instability. We can expect like rise of anger, really, even though really people maybe unorganized or not really organized, protest movements, but potentially some, forms of protest that really express the dissatisfaction, the deep dissatisfaction of many people in this region. I mean, if you take the case of Egypt, I mean, Egyptian people, they paid a high price of economic and fiscal adjustment during the first, actually, IMF agreement. Just to give you a number, actually, the poverty rate increased from 27% in 2016 at the beginning of the IMF program to 33% at the end. And with the COVID, things, they have been even, I mean, deteriorated. So in Tunisia, the numbers are also really disastrous. So either, I mean, the unemployment rates, the poverty rates, I mean, 1/5 of the population is living under the poverty, threshold, etc. So it shows to what extent in this region, I think people are really extremely tired. I cannot see how they can afford another round of austerity under a new IMF package. Probably, and I think there will be need really for a sort of stabilizing these economies. Probably also the stability of the EU, and I think will depend, I mean, in a way, on the stability, in a way or another, on the stability of the southern neighborhood region, because otherwise, I think the situation will be extremely shaky in many countries, actually, from Morocco to Egypt. We cannot, yeah, there is this battle of narratives, clearly. I mean, you mentioned this, but my understanding is really people are really not extremely sensitive to the Russian narrative. And probably also there is an opportunity in a way that the way, I mean, Russia has operated in Ukraine, the way also the world stood against, Putin, is also a message to many dictators that this can be, I mean, dictatorship and authoritarian regimes are really not the solution. So really, we are in the middle of unstable and uncertain times. Cannot say that there are positive prospects, but in another side, probably also people will try really to bring autocrats and political leaders to really fix and address concrete and really concrete demands and concrete expectations when it comes to social and economic rights.
Thank you. And Ray, what about South Africa in these terms? We have observed quite confusing political messages coming from South African leadership, which took a rather, let's say, pro-Russian neutral stance. There were phone calls between President Ramaphosa and Mr. Putin, where even there was a talk of South Africa playing a mediator role. But last week we also had a phone call coming from President Zelensky to Mr. Ramaphosa, and I'm just reading from Ramaphosa's Twitter his notes on this phone call. And on 21st April he wrote, "I had a telephone conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine to discuss the conflicts as well as its global ramifications. We agree on a need for a negotiated end of the conflict, which has impacted Ukraine's place in global supply chains, including its position as a major exporter of food to our continent. President Zelensky anticipates closer relations with Africa in the future." Do you see any change, any evolution of the stance of South Africa in the context of the food crisis? Does it change the perspective or not really?
No, I don't think so. I mean, firstly, if you compare the accounts from the president of the two meetings, firstly, President Putin is His Excellency. I had a very good meeting with His Excellency, President Putin, but it's kind of Mr. Zelensky. And it happened a few weeks later, I think, after there was quite a lot of unhappiness in the country with the apparently taking sides in this conflict. So, I mean, South Africa went so far as to propose an alternative resolution at the UN, which didn't refer to this as an invasion or a war, but as a conflict to be settled, etc., which was rejected and was only supported by 6 member states. So I think part of the problem here is that, I don't want to get off the topic too much, but it's quite interesting, is the relationship between the South African elites and Russia. So there are a number of oil and gas projects which are being fired up at the moment because South Africa has a critical energy shortage, including plans to pipe gas from offshore terminals that would be supplied from, the speculation is, Russia, amongst others, and the building of various gas plants. And South Africa has put back on the agenda the possibility of a nuclear power station or two. And the last time that was on the agenda, the Russians were the front runners to build it under President Zuma. And the whole thing was torpedoed due to corruption allegations. So I think the South African elite sees a lot of potential rent coming out of the relationship with Russia, because these huge infrastructure projects are always become big feeding grounds. They require local partners, and the political elite gets very involved and inevitably makes an awful lot of money out of them. And they always run over budget and over time and are underproductive. So I think that context is more relevant. I think the lens that people apply with development aid in sub-Saharan Africa is probably more a security lens than anything. I mean, by far the highest recipient of aid, sub-Saharan Africa, is Ethiopia. And up there is Kenya and Uganda. And I think that relates to a lot of the concerns about security in the Horn of Africa region. And it's not really tied necessarily to, what Sami was talking about, which is how good a democratic performance are these various governments putting in. Certainly in the case of Uganda, the last election was a complete fiasco and resulted in say, the military surrounding the leader of the opposition's house and not letting him move for a couple of weeks. And so I think that's the key concern, security more than anything. And I'm not sure that it's really going to be changed or moved by the Russia-Ukraine problem. But it'll be interesting to see what attitudes would be towards, for example, Ethiopia, which has been, very uncritical of the Russian invasion.
Thank you. And Patrick, what about India? You are in India now. Do you see any ramifications of the food crisis on the political stance of India towards the Russian invasion?
No, not really. The Indian government and Indian population feels the global ramifications and impact on the food prices and energy, but it has no impact on Indian foreign policy, which is driven by national strategic security interests. So the general attitude, I think, is, across Africa and other places is that we wish this war to finish at the earliest. We will probably not take sides in this conflict. We just want the war to be stopped and some political diplomatic solution to be found. India also can see an opportunity in this international situation, as India is allowing for export of some agricultural products. For example, it has agreed to export wheat to Egypt. It is considering increased export of other products to other countries. So it also gives in India an opportunity to play a positive role of responsible stakeholder and country that can support other developing countries in the terms of South-South cooperation, and it can present itself as a part of the solution. But even though the negative consequences of the war in Ukraine is being felt here, it has no any impact on foreign policy.
Thank you. I believe we are about to conclude because the time is running short. We're running short of time. Actually, we're already past the timing that we were supposed to conclude. So maybe we'll just do a round of a wrap up of final thoughts. That my reading of this entire conversation is that there is not enough focus on systemic reforms and too much focus on attempts to come up with some short-term usual responses. Definitely, surely there is no easy way to contain the crisis, and this is what the policymakers in the global institutions need to understand and need to project in the long run. Please, gentlemen, what is your main point in this conversation, and do you see any set of policies that should really be adapted nowadays by governments of the regions and by international players that could offer a way out? Maybe let's start with Lebanon.
Sure. I mean, really, I think that we need to start transitioning away from subsidy regimes. We need to move towards welfare state that's funded by progressive taxation. That means that elites have to give up some power, and we can then think about the other technical solutions when it comes to food sovereignty, seeds, land, tools, but this can't be all centralized. It can't be a centralized system. It needs to be decentralized. People need to be empowered to define their own food security. And I think that's what's going to be important moving forward for the West. I mean, I think we've mentioned it several times. You know, the EU and Lebanon needs to move on the sanctions regime if there's nothing going on in terms of the financial crisis being resolved. And I think we need to, have a similar approach across the region.
A final word from Hamza Madib, who's running to another meeting.
Yeah. I think, as I said, I mean, there is this double deficit. I mean, the energy and food deficit is getting really extremely crucial and to address for many countries. So investing in the renewable energy, investing in or promoting and undertaking actually land reform is really strategic and has become actually strategic. Boosting and encouraging, I think, domestic production is also important. Reforming the subsidy system is inescapable for countries like Tunisia and Egypt, and basically opening up these economies to investment and to promote investment in but also new forms of investment in a sort of the cooperative sector can play an important role, especially in farming and agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ray, what are the best recommendations that the governments of the region should take, and for the international institutions to approach the crisis in the region?
I think in the short term, there should be some urgent planning to try and ameliorate what's going to be a pretty bad humanitarian crisis. That's going to start manifesting itself with the rise in fuel and food prices and the interaction between the two. And then I think longer term, it's got to be to reform agricultural production in Southern Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's tremendous natural potential, but a lot of it is ruined by very bad policy making, poor governance, and these very, very inefficient structures that manage agricultural produce, the import and export of agricultural produce. That reform, I think, is urgent, and that's where attention needs to be paid.
Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you to our audience for being with us and for posting questions. This conversation will be available to be replayed on our YouTube channel, and I think on our Facebook channel as well. So it was a pleasure to host you, and thank you for thought-provoking conversation and some good recommendations. And good luck with your work, and hope to work with you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.